At 19 years old, Mason Reed lost everything on a Tuesday. The firing lasted less than 3 minutes. His manager didn't even look uncomfortable. Corporate's making cuts. Mason stared across the desk. I've worked here 2 years. I know. The manager sighed. I'm sorry. But he didn't sound sorry. Within 10 minutes, Mason carried a cardboard box through the parking lot containing everything that remained of his job. A coffee mug, 2 notebooks, a framed photo of his grandfather, and a paycheck that wouldn't last long. The situation became worse when he returned home. His roommate was waiting. That alone felt suspicious. Trent never waited for anything. We need to talk. Mason immediately hated those words. By sunset, he no longer had a place to live. Trent's girlfriend had moved in. They wanted the apartment to themselves. Mason had 36 hours to leave. Seriously? Trent avoided eye contact. It's just business. Business. Mason nearly laughed. Funny how people always called it business when they were doing something selfish. 3 days later, he loaded everything he owned into his aging pickup truck. His savings account contained just over $2,000. Not enough for another apartment. Not enough for a fresh start. Not enough for much of anything. The only bright spot arrived in the form of a phone call. A lawyer. The woman sounded surprised he answered. Mr. Reed? Yes. I'm calling regarding your grandfather's estate. Mason sat upright. His grandfather, Walter Reed, had passed away 6 months earlier. The old man had raised him after his parents died in a car accident. Walter was the closest thing Mason had ever had to a father. What about it? The lawyer cleared her throat. There's one remaining item. Mason frowned. The estate had already been settled. His grandfather hadn't possessed much money. Just a modest house and some personal belongings. What's left? An antique grandfather clock. Mason blinked. A clock. Your grandfather specifically requested that it be transferred directly to you. That was it. His inheritance. A clock. Most people would have been disappointed. Mason wasn't. The clock had stood in Walter's living room for as long as he could remember. The massive oak structure chimed every hour. As a child, Mason would sit beside it listening to stories while his grandfather repaired watches at the kitchen table. The old man loved clocks. Loved how they measured life. Loved how they kept moving forward no matter what happened. The memory alone made the inheritance feel valuable. The problem was where to put it. He didn't exactly have a home anymore. The answer came unexpectedly. Walter's old house hadn't sold. The market was slow. The property remained vacant. The estate lawyer agreed to let Mason stay there temporarily while deciding what to do with the clock. 3 days later, he drove to the small town where he had grown up. The house sat exactly as he remembered. Small, simple, quiet. For the first time in weeks, Mason felt something close to relief. The place needed cleaning, needed repairs, needed life, but at least it existed. The grandfather clock stood in the corner of the living room, waiting. The sight immediately brought back memories. Walter winding it every Sunday. Walter polishing the wood. Walter warning everyone never to force the mechanism. It's older than all of us, he'd always say. Treat it with respect. Mason smiled despite everything. That first night, he slept on the living room couch. The house creaked occasionally. Wind rattled branches against the roof. Nothing unusual. Then, shortly after midnight, he heard it. A metallic click. His eyes opened. The sound came from the clock. He sat up. The room remained dark. Moonlight spilled through the windows. The clock stood motionless. Then came another click, followed by a faint grinding noise. Mason approached cautiously. The mechanism appeared normal. The pendulum swung steadily. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Nothing seemed wrong. Eventually, he returned to bed. The next morning, curiosity lingered. The sound hadn't resembled ordinary clockwork. It had sounded mechanical, almost deliberate. Throughout the day, he cleaned the house. The more he worked, the more memories surfaced. Many involved his grandfather and the clock. Odd memories. Walter constantly checking the cabinet. Walter becoming irritated whenever visitors touched it. Walter occasionally opening the back panel and disappearing from view for several minutes. At the time, Mason never questioned it. Now he wondered. That evening, he inspected the clock carefully. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Hand-carved oak, brass fittings, intricate internal gears. Yet something seemed unusual. The cabinet appeared deeper than necessary. Far deeper. He measured it twice. The dimensions didn't make sense. Not for the mechanism inside. A hollow space seemed to exist somewhere behind the movement. His pulse quickened. Maybe there was a storage compartment. Many antique clocks had hidden drawers. Walter loved unusual things. The possibility felt reasonable. Mason examined every panel, every hinge, every surface. Nothing, until he noticed a tiny brass pin concealed beneath decorative carving near the base. He pressed it. A soft click echoed. Then silence. For several seconds nothing happened. Mason frowned. Then part of the interior shifted. A hidden panel slowly slid backward. His mouth fell open. Behind the clock mechanism sat a concealed compartment. Inside were bundles. Dozens of them, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Mason's hands trembled. He removed one. Then another. Cash. Stacks and stacks of cash. Old bills. New bills. More money than he had ever seen. His breathing accelerated. There had to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. The compartment continued deeper into the clock. Far deeper. He reached farther inside. His fingers touched something else. A metal box. Heavy. Locked. A note rested on top. The handwriting was unmistakable. Walter's. Mason carefully unfolded it. The message contained only 2 sentences. If you found this, then things have gone badly. Do not tell the family until you read what's inside the box. A chill moved through him. The family? What family? Walter barely spoke to most relatives. Why would they matter? Mason grabbed a screwdriver and forced the small lock. The lid opened. Inside lay several documents. Property records, maps, bank statements, and one photograph. The moment Mason saw the image, his blood ran cold. The photograph showed his grandfather standing beside 3 men. One of them was Mason's Uncle Richard. The second was a local banker. The third man was someone Mason recognized immediately from television. A wealthy real estate developer currently buying large amounts of land throughout the county. On the back of the photo, Walter had written a single warning. They never found what they were looking for. Before Mason could process the message, headlights suddenly swept across the living room window. A vehicle had just pulled into the driveway. Then another. And another. Mason moved toward the curtain. His stomach dropped. 3 black SUVs sat outside, and Uncle Richard was climbing out of the first one. Mason's heart pounded. 3 black SUVs sat in the driveway. Their headlights illuminated the old house like spotlights. Uncle Richard stepped out first. 2 men in expensive suits followed. One of them looked familiar. Mason recognized him from local news broadcasts. Victor Crane, the real estate developer from the photograph. The same man standing beside Grandpa Walter years ago. A loud knock echoed through the house. Then another. Richard's voice followed. Mason. No greeting. No concern. Just urgency. Mason immediately understood something important. They knew. Maybe not about the cash. Maybe not about the hidden compartment. But they knew something existed. The timing was too perfect. His eyes dropped to Walter's note. They never found what they were looking for. The words suddenly felt much heavier. Another knock. Mason opened the door. Instead, Mason grabbed the documents and carried them into the kitchen. He quickly scanned the papers. Bank statements, land records, maps. Then he found a sealed envelope. Across the front, Walter had written, "Open only if Richard comes." Mason's stomach tightened. He tore it open. Inside was a handwritten letter. Richard will eventually come looking. If he does, it means he has failed again. Do not trust him. The knocking grew louder. Mason kept reading. 30 years ago, Richard and I discovered something valuable beneath Mercer Valley. Not gold. Not oil. Water. Mason frowned. Water? The letter continued. The largest untouched freshwater spring in the county. Now his attention sharpened. Water rights could be worth fortunes, especially during drought years. Walter explained everything. Decades earlier, geological surveys had revealed an enormous underground aquifer beneath thousands of acres of undeveloped land. The discovery was never made public. A group of investors, including Victor Crane, tried acquiring the land quietly before anyone learned its value. Richard joined them. So did the local banker. Walter initially participated. Then he changed his mind. According to the letter, the plan would have displaced hundreds of local families. Farmers, ranchers, entire communities. Walter refused. The partnership collapsed. The friendship ended. But one problem remained. The survey maps. Without them, nobody could prove the aquifer existed. Walter took the original records and disappeared. For 30 years, Mason flipped through the documents. The maps. The bank statements. The records. They were all here. The proof everyone had been searching for. Outside, Richard pounded on the door. "Mason," Victor Crane's voice followed. "We just want to talk." That sentence alone told Mason everything. Powerful people never drove across the county at night just to talk. The grandfather clock suddenly made sense. The hidden money, the secret compartment, the warning. Walter hadn't hidden a fortune. He had hidden leverage. A backup plan. Another envelope slipped from between the papers. This one contained a final note. "The cash is yours. The spring belongs to the people living above it. Don't let them steal it." Mason sat silently. For a moment, he could almost hear his grandfather speaking. The old man had spent decades protecting something. Now the responsibility belonged to him. A loud crash echoed from the front porch. The visitors had stopped being patient. Richard's voice grew sharper. "We know you found the clock." Mason froze. So they knew about the compartment. Maybe not the contents. But enough. Another crash shook the door. The old house wouldn't hold forever. Mason grabbed the documents and moved upstairs. A memory suddenly surfaced. When he was 12, Walter had shown him a hidden exit. An old coal delivery tunnel built beneath the house generations earlier. At the time it felt like an adventure. Now it felt like survival. He found the concealed hatch in the basement exactly where he remembered. Outside, the front door finally splintered. Wood cracked. Voices flooded into the house. Mason descended into darkness. The tunnel stretched nearly 200 yards before emerging behind an abandoned barn. By the time Richard and Victor searched the house, Mason was already driving toward town. The next morning changed everything. Instead of negotiating, instead of hiding, instead of selling, Mason walked directly into the county courthouse, then the state environmental office, then 3 major newspapers. By sunset, copies of every document existed in dozens of places. The secret was no longer secret. And once exposed, events moved quickly. The geological surveys were verified. The aquifer was real. Very real. Experts estimated it could supply water for the region for generations. The land immediately became a matter of public interest. Investigations followed. Old financial records resurfaced. Questionable property acquisitions received scrutiny. Victor Crane's business dealings attracted attention from state regulators. The local banker retired unexpectedly. And Richard? Richard disappeared from public view entirely. Mason never heard from him again. Months later, the county established a protected water district. The aquifer could no longer be privately controlled, exactly as Walter had hoped. As for the cash hidden inside the clock, after taxes and legal review, it became Mason's inheritance. More than enough to change his life. He paid off debts, bought a modest home, returned to school. But the biggest change wasn't financial. For the first time since losing his job, he had direction, purpose. One afternoon nearly a year later, Mason returned to Walter's house. The property had been restored. Fresh paint, repaired porch, new windows. The grandfather clock still stood in the same corner. Tick, tock, tick, tock, steady as ever. Mason opened the hidden compartment one final time. It was empty now. The money gone. The documents archived. The secrets revealed. Only a small note remained. He had somehow missed it before. Folded into the back corner. Carefully he unfolded it. The handwriting made him smile instantly. "Walter." The final message contained only a few words. "You were always the right choice." Mason stood quietly in the fading afternoon light. The old clock continued keeping time, just as it always had. His grandfather had understood something important. Money could disappear. Property could be lost. Jobs could come and go. But character mattered. Choices mattered. And when everything else was stripped away, those were the things that determined a person's future. A year earlier, Mason had been fired, homeless, and nearly hopeless. Now he stood inside the house that had saved his life. Not because of the money hidden inside the clock, but because his grandfather had trusted him with something far more valuable. The chance to do the right thing. And that inheritance turned out to be worth more than millions.